Alrighty, so I'm going to start out with just telling you a little bit of backstory about the film, and then I'm definitely very excited to hear some feedback and learn more about Jacksonville and the connection between what you just saw and the history of this local area. So The Other Boys of Summer started as my passion project, which means it's a project that nobody's paying you to do. Nobody's paying you to make it. And the reason I made the film was because it didn't make sense to me, segregation and racism. I'm not discounting it was real, I believed it, I still believe it, but the why is something that I had a really hard time with. And so what I wanted to do was, if given the opportunity, hear stories from people who lived it firsthand and hear what it was like for them to pursue their dreams in spite of their circumstances. And one of my favorite things, people always ask me, one of my favorite things about making this film was obviously meeting the players, but most importantly, learning about their humility and grace. Because personally, when I heard their stories, I couldn't understand why they weren't angry. I said to every player who I interviewed, you know, if I had to go through the story you just told me, I can't imagine how I would handle that. And every player answered the same way. They all said, it was just a different time. Things were different then. And you know what? I got to play baseball. They paid me to play baseball. What was I going to be angry about? And so I think that humility and grace just, to me, made them stand out amongst what I would have expected the response to have been. And so that's when I fell in love with the players. And hopefully you guys had a little bit of that experience as well, getting to meet on screen some of the guys and women who you'd probably never heard of before. So with that little backstory, I'm going to start asking a little bit of my co-panelists here. So we've got representation here from Edward Waters, and for those of you who may not be familiar with it as well, I won't go too deep because you know way more about this than I do, but the legendary Buck O'Neill attended Edward Waters College. And so I'd love to enable you, Henry, to share a little bit about that history, and then I definitely want to hear your first thoughts also about seeing the film for the first time.
Yes, in reference to Buck, Buck came to Edward Waters as a high school student at first, because Edward Waters back in those days was high school and college, so it was a 2-year college at that time.
Okay.
So Buck came to Jacksonville because Edward Waters was the only high school representative in the state of Florida at that time, because he came out of Central South Florida. He came and played for Edward Waters High School for 1 year, and then he played for Edward Waters College. And at that time, he was able to play with the Jacksonville Redcaps for just a minute, which was the pool porters here in Jacksonville that had a team.
Okay.
And that team was the Redcaps, and they played on Sunday afternoons here in Jacksonville. Well, then he had the great idea to leave Jacksonville and go to the Midwest to play baseball in the Midwest. And therefore, when he played for the Kansas City Monarchs and stayed there, he then had the privilege to play for the Kansas City Royals afterwards and become a manager at the Kansas City Royals during his career there in the great Kansas City area.
Yeah, and if some of you might not know who Buck O'Neill is, because that was on me, I didn't set him up very well. So Buck O'Neill is a Hall of Fame baseball player. He was just recently inducted in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, even though I can't imagine who in the world would have thought he shouldn't have been inducted many years ago.
True.
But so growing up in the state of Florida, it's unfathomable to me how there was only one high school he could attend, and that was purely because of the color of his skin.
That is correct.
So that brings us down to the end of our panelists here. Lloyd, can you tell me a little bit about Jacksonville and the history? And Lloyd is the president of the Durkeeville Historical Society, and correct me if I don't have the title right.
It's Durkeeville. Durkeeville was the very first public housing complex in the city of Jacksonville, originally built in 1936 and finished in 1947. It was a WPA project. The most important thing was it gave black men a chance to earn a living. Out of every 10 black men, only 3 3 had what we considered as jobs. The rest of them hustled. They did put in windows, they did construction, but a regular job they had when they built Durkeeville. Like I said, it was originally built in 1936, finished in 1937. It was a WPA project. It helped a great deal, and the entire area grew around Durkeeville. The funny thing about it was the ballpark was just right across the street. So I had a privilege of meeting Buster Hare. Buster Hare played for the Monarchs, and he was a ball player. He had a .380 batting average, and he was a third shortstop and he played third base and shortstop. And he was a fantastic ball player, but he grew up right across the street from the park. So he says every time the lights came on, it went into his window, and that gave him the emphasis of wanting to play ball. And also he was one of the bat boys for the Jacksonville Ritz.
What were some of the things that resonated with you in terms of relating to the history that you've been studying and the life that you've lived in Jacksonville?
What I studied was the effect of Jim Crow laws and racism on a sport. Mr. Hare I sat down and talked with Mr. Hare and Art Hamilton, who played for the Indianapolis Clowns and the Denver Stars. And they would talk about the challenges of being a black baseball player.
For me, one of the things that stood out to me always was when Curly Williams talks about how he was playing in the minor leagues and they set up his table in the kitchen when it was time for him to have, for team meals. And the fact that he talked about what hurt him the most was that there was somebody from another country that was from Mexico brought in and was his roommate, but he was able to sit out in the restaurant while Curly had to sit in the kitchen and watch everything through the doors that would swing open. And when he told me that he would cry himself to sleep every night because it made him feel better, every time, I've seen the film probably 1,000 times and I don't think that's an exaggeration, every time I still get chills with that. So I'd love to kind of find out from both of you, what were some of the things that resonated with you or that, you can relate in terms of your personal life growing up in this area?
Well, first and foremost, the documentary, it was a fair documentary. I must say to you, thank you. Or so, because they had to travel and they couldn't find a place. But they had a book called the Green Book. And the Green Book allowed them to find the next place or the next hotel that allowed coloreds to be able to stay overnight. And in some places in the South, you couldn't get a hotel for the Negro League in a small town. You had to go to a major city that offered those particular hotels and residence. It was a lot of times it wasn't hotels; it was someone's house.
Yep.
And I started laughing about the funeral home because I've heard of that before. That the funeral home actually was a place to stay.
I definitely would not want to spend the night in the funeral home.
But overall, the document showed you everything that happened in that time period. And I had a chance to see for myself as growing up as a young man here in Jacksonville, those signs that you saw in the documentary. A water fountain that was just colored on it, and a water fountain that was white on it.
And when that started to change, what was that like for you to see those changes happen? And also for reference for myself as well as everybody, can you give any kind of timeline of when did this change?
I didn't see the change in Jacksonville until about 1968, 1969, you would say?
Yeah, 1968, 69.
About 1968, 69,
Wow.
we saw the change.
That's insane to think it was that recently.
Yes, yes it was. Because we didn't get a chance to integrate until 1970s, 1971.
70s, late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, late 60s, early 70s. So we actually was part of that last crew of counties that were allowed to be desegregated.
Wow. And when you think about this area, I don't know if Lloyd, if that might fall under your expertise or let me know if I'm going beyond what you're comfortable with. But in terms of this area as the center of arts in the Afro-American community, can you share a little bit about that? Because again, I'm coming to Jacksonville. I don't know that much detail about the Jacksonville history, but I want to connect it back to what we've seen in the film.
Well, if I may step back just a second.
Please.
When I was in 10th grade going to Stanton High School, before I got my first book that didn't have somebody else's name in it.
Wow.
You know, I'm going, okay, here we go. And I was sort of surprised. I'm opening up the book and I'm used to seeing someone else's name or someone writing in the book. I got a brand new book. So I grew up under the era of separate but equal. But it was no such thing as separate but equal. And I grew up, there's a place downtown used to be called Grant's. You could go there and they had a place in the corner where you could get a Grant hot dog and a can of Coke. A writer by the name of Rodney Hurst wrote a book. It was more to it than about a hot dog and a Coke. But you could come there and you could not sit down and order a meal. But you could go in that corner and get a hot dog and a Coke. I must admit that I did enjoy the hot dogs. Grant had some good hot dogs, I don't want to admit that.
Yeah.
But that was life here in Jacksonville. It was nothing. I recently went to a book signing for the former Sheriff Glover. He used to work for Morrison Cafeteria. He could clean dishes, he could wash, that's what he was, a dishwasher. But he couldn't go in Morrison Cafeteria and sit down and eat a meal. So we've come a great way, but we still have a long way to go. And as far as the film is concerned, I have a little twist to it because being a member of the Durkeeville Historical Society, my predecessor, Dr. Carolyn Williams, historian and president, she had this thing about the Negro Leagues. She was a fantastic historian and a heck of a person, but she loved the Negro League. So for the first 3 years of my membership, every year she would have a salute to the Negro League. When we started off with Ed Waters College, and we started off with 11 Negro League players. Mm. And it was nothing for you to sit down and these people would tell you the same thing that you saw in the film. You know, I mean, you got to be kidding me. He said, no, that's what it was. But Buster Hare, has this marvelous sense of humor. And he would say, boy, I said, I didn't mind going to the back door and getting a meal. And I'm going, what's with this? He goes, because all the cooks in the back were black women. They fed as well. So, you know, you have to look at it in two ways. And I imagine that sense of humor helped him through a lot going through the Negro Leagues. A brief story from Mr. Hare. Mr. Hare, you saw the end of the tape where the guy said he matched up against Satchel Paige. Mm-hmm. Well, in Durkeeville, Mr. Hare is young, fast, arrogant, and it was his turn back. He said he stood there and he said he heard the ball go by. Strike one. He heard the ball go by. Strike two. So he said this time he started swinging before he heard the ball. And he, just ripped into it. And then he ran to first base and he said, "Oh God, what have I done?" And he said, "It's a good thing my mom taught me how to pray." Because the closer he got to second base, and there used to be a big green monster in Durkeeville, the ball hit the top of the field and bounced back. Hit the top of the green monster back. And he said, he stood there until Satchel Paige struck out everybody else. So when he got into the dugout, he told the coach, "I don't feel good. My stomach's bothering me. I can't play it." And so he finally talked the coach out of letting him, because he realized one thing. He had 3 more times at bat. So he said, "It's a good thing my mom taught me how to pray."
So when it comes to sports today, and Edward Waters College, historically, what have you seen in terms of sports and the baseball team? I know that every program we do, there's always a conversation about opportunities and the lack of opportunities, and the numbers in Major League Baseball for players of African American descent, any black players, has drastically dropped. And one thing that I learned while doing this is that there's an enormous percentage of Negro League Baseball players who had some form of college education. They went to the HBCUs, where at the same time period, the players who played in Major League Baseball primarily had high school educations. So the HBCU connection is never lost on me in terms of creating, as people to call it, full citizens. It's not just about sports, it's not just about the degree, it's about creating opportunities and building a space where people can thrive.
Well, I take a page out of the great Willie Mays and look at the perspective of what he was talking about, and that was to have the opportunity to play for a historic black college, and have the opportunity to move through the ranks from the minor league to the major league. And it gave him an opportunity to come back home and let others know that you can take the same path. And so it has taken a course where we had a great percentage of black players playing in the majors after the deception of the Negro League. But during the time, we can look at, and Brother Washington can respond on this as well. I would say from 1967 to about 1988, we were very strong.
Yes.
We were very strong in the league. We didn't see a decline until about the mid-90s of the Negro League effect that had on the major league. So therefore, we had a good run, but now we have to rebound from that and rebuild. Although the major league has now stepped out, right, and say let's rebuild, we now have to take that by the horn and show the average kid who is interested in playing baseball, that you can be an African American and play basketball. I think what happens in today's world, as I see it, is that travel ball has taken a different turn. And most African Americans, to be honest with you, who are at risk, can't afford to be able to be a part of travel ball. So with the Major League coming in and being able to put funds in place to establish these different African American youth teams, which we saw this past summer.
Yes.
Here in Jacksonville. We had about 3 at-risk teams that were African American kids who are now excited about baseball again. And just to see their faces this past summer was a great thing.
Yeah, and that's one thing too, that, you know, part of the experience of bringing the other boys of summer to different communities is having that chance to, you know, talk with people and hopefully enable people to learn about the history and the legacy, but also be inspired by the players that they had the chance to listen to. So within the film, another thing that surprised me when I first met the players was when they spoke about Jackie Robinson not being the best player when he first started. And I was shocked by that because I just expected, number one, that he was the best player, and number two, that nobody's gonna ever say anything other than that. And I think it was important, just the candidness of him being the right person for the task at hand, and it wasn't just about baseball. And his wife, his widow Rachel, has gone on to do so much well beyond what Jackie had done on the field, and his legacy is so much bigger than baseball. And I think that also is something that when people watch the film, they learn so much more beyond what's within the lines and on the diamond.
Definitely. And if you have the opportunity to see the documentation also with Reggie and Hank Aaron sitting at the table having a conversation about how they came through the segregation part as well, and you see that they had the opportunity to play the game, but they also had the opportunity to become managers and to become second level or executives within those programs, like Reggie with Houston and Hank Aaron with the Braves and Atlanta.
And to that point, when Jackie Robinson, his last public appearance, I believe it was the World Series, and it was in Cincinnati, I think. And what he said when he came to the microphone was he couldn't wait until the day he looked down the third baseline and saw somebody who looked like him coaching.
Yes.
And Frank Robinson was the one who stepped into that role, I believe.
That's correct.
And so at this point, I don't know if there are specific questions from the audience, if there's any, whether it's players or anybody from the community. It's hard to see some of you, but if there's questions, you know, just kind of raise your hand. We're happy to answer them. A few other things that I can kind of share a little backstory on, which is kind of, I think people tend to enjoy it, is so Mamie Peanut Johnson, just for a show of hands, before tonight, who knew that there were women who played professional baseball? Yay! It's a pretty good turnout there. So when I discovered that there are 3 women who, and actually it's 4, but 3 women who are primarily, you know, the ones known to play in the Negro Leagues, I thought, well, I want to interview them, I want to meet them. And at the time, only Mamie Peanut Johnson was the one still living. And so Bob Scott, he's the guy in the New York Black Yankees, he was probably spoke the most in the film, he was friends with her. He was the first interview I did. So I said, you know, Bob, I just, you know, if there's any way you think that you can help me meet with Mamie, I'd love to interview her and enable her to tell her story. And he said, I don't really know, she's not doing this that well, and I could ask her, but I don't really think so. And mind you, I had just met Bob, so I didn't have a relationship with him. And I just kind of, first interview, I was gonna be a little shy about it. I kind of like, okay, and I pretty much let it go. Bob and I became good friends. He would call me all the time. And then one day, many, many years later, this is in like 2016, I think it was, I interviewed Bob in 2007. So we're talking 9 years later. Bob calls me up and he said, do you know Mamie Johnson? I'm like, well, I know who she is, Bob, but I don't know her. He's just like, I was talking with her. She wants to be in your movie. So I was just like, really? That's amazing. He's like, yeah, go call her and call me back. And I'm like, I don't have Mamie Johnson's phone number. Anyway, to condense the story, he gave me the number. He's like, okay, go call her, call me right back. Well, there's nothing like being put on the spot. Like, I had to call her right then and there. So I called her, I got her answering machine, left her a message, called Bob back. He's like, oh, she'll call you back. And within 2 weeks, I was sitting in her house in Washington, D.C., having the opportunity to hear her stories. So for me, that was kind of one of those things where you never know what opportunity you're going to have, but you have nothing to lose if you don't go after it. And so from the group here, if there's anything specific that we don't talk about or that you had a question about regarding to the making of the film or the history up here, again, just raise your hand. We've probably got about, I'm going to say, I can't see Dave, but I think about 5-10 minutes. Yes? Okay, cool. So with that in mind, I've got a question. So
Did any of those players have children or grandchildren that played in the majors later on?
that's a really good question. I got to think about that. A lot of them, obviously their kids played baseball. So John Mule Miles is a great, interesting character. So he played, as you met him, he was the one who batted against Satchel Paige in the last story. So what he said was, you know, his kids had the chance to play anything they wanted, and they were all really good athletes. I think he had four sons, I think. I had the opportunity to meet one of his grandsons, who I became friendly with, and we uncovered so much more history in terms of just what his grandfather had enabled, you know, whether it's his sons or kids in their neighborhood. He became really involved in the church, and he would also get involved with schools. He would go to elementary schools every year and just was there to share his story. He wasn't looking for any fame or fortune from it. He just wanted to be able to give people the opportunity to see somebody who did this, so that if you see it, then you believe you have that opportunity. So I'd have to think deeper about if any of them had kids who played professionally. I know that there's a great family, the Hairston family, which has 5 generations of professional baseball players who started in the Negro Leagues in the early 1900s up until today. So that's 5 generations of players. But the players who I interviewed off the top of my head, I can't think of anybody. Yes, there's some questions on this side. Okay, I only was able to hear part of it, so why did I choose? Oh, why did I choose? So the question is, why did I choose baseball and segregation? I grew up just as a baseball fan. I liked baseball. And my mom was a teacher, and one time she called me up, and this is when I was in college. She called me up and she was telling me, she was teaching I think 2nd or 3rd grade at the time. She called me up and she was telling me about her plans for Black History Month, and she was a teacher that everybody loved. I mean, she retired recently, but she's like one of those teachers that had really cool plans. And she called me up and she was telling me about her plans, and I was just kind of, if I'm gonna be honest with you, I was just kind of a little bored by what her idea was. And I was like, well, how can I make this more interesting? And so with that in mind, I started thinking about how I could do it. And I said, you know what, I would love to learn more about the history of segregation through people who lived it and through baseball, because I like baseball. And I didn't really know anything about the Negro Leagues when I started it, but as soon as I started talking to players, I just couldn't help but want to hear more from them.
What position did Mamie play?
So Mamie, she was a pitcher. She was the only woman who pitched in the Negro Leagues. And another great little story about that was she actually saw an ad. She was about 18 years old. She saw an ad in the paper for tryouts for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. So for those of you who might not know that, that's from the movie A League of Their Own. So it was the All-Women's Baseball League. She saw that ad, and she and her best friend from high school got on a bus, traveled to Richmond, Virginia from DC, and wanted to try out for the team. And when she got there, they weren't allowed to try out because of the color of their skin. And so she came back to DC and was pitching in a semi-pro men's league. And a little while later, when she was pitching, a scout for the Indianapolis Clowns was at the game and approached her afterwards and said, would you be interested in playing in the Negro Leagues? And she was just like, where do I sign up? And the next day she was on a bus off to spring training. So that was her, you know, she said to me that she was so thankful that she didn't have that chance to play for the women's team, because if she had, she never would have had the chance to be the only woman to pitch in the Negro Leagues. Yes, we've got a question.
First of all, thank you for bringing up Mr. Hare. He's one of my favorite people in the world and a Jacksonville treasure. I wanted to first give you kudos on the film. I thought it was amazing. I know you must have hundreds of hours of film. And it's hard to make a film about the Negro Leagues without talking about that family, which you did allude to. Can you just tell a little bit, put a little bit more color to what the players had to say about that and her impact on the league?
Absolutely, I love Effa Manley, so I could talk about that all day long. But so Effa Manley, she was so respected by the players who played for her, and that was something special for me to have the chance to speak to a number of players who played for Effa. And so she is the only female inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. The women from a league of their own from that league are inducted as a group, but Effa is the only woman inducted. She's inducted as a baseball executive. And she was respected by all the players as the person who ran the day-to-day. And she had a great reputation for really taking care of her players. She also took advantage of the opportunity that she had because she was a fair-skinned woman. And actually there's an interview with Effa that I've listened to where there's always a question about Effa Manley as, was she white, was she black? There's been this debate forever. Well, I think it was 1978 or so, she did an interview and she said she was white, so I don't know what the debate's about. But she used that to her advantage because sometimes when the guys would be on the road, they couldn't get hotel rooms. If they walked in or somebody with dark skin walked into the lobby, they would turn them away, even if they might have made a reservation. So Effa, when she would travel with the team, which she didn't do all the time, she would be the one to go into the lobby and secure the keys for the guys, and that's one of the ways that she made sure that her players were well taken care of, and they weren't being, you know, turned away when they had every right to be there. And so that's one thing that Effa did. She's famous, if you can use the word famous. Of course, most people never heard of Effa Manley, but she was the one who was responsible for Larry Doby actually being paid a fair wage when he was signed by Cleveland. So Larry Doby signed with Cleveland just about 2.5 months after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier with Brooklyn. When Branch Rickey signed Jackie, he didn't go to the Monarchs, to the KC Monarchs at all. He didn't ask for permission. He disregarded the fact that he had a contract. He just took him. Well, Effa said, that's not gonna happen on my team. And so she talked with Bill Beck, who was managing or the owner of the Cleveland Indians, and they went back and forth, and she said, I'm not going to stand in the way of Doby. He's a great player, but you're going to have to pay me. He's under contract. And so she made sure that Larry Doby part of the deal was he will never be paid less than what he's making currently in the Negro Leagues, and he should be paid more. And Beck did that and did give him a bonus because he was still with the team. I think it was 30 or 60 days later, so he gave him the bonus. But she also had Monty Irvin on her team, and there was a long, it's kind of a joke between them that, he wanted to play, she wasn't going to relinquish this contract unless she got paid fairly for it. He wanted a certain amount of money, and ultimately there was a joke later in life where Effa said that basically she sold Monty Irvin for a mink coat. So when Monty signed with the New York Giants, she got a couple of $1,000s and she bought herself a mink coat. But thanks for bringing her up. It was hard not to include more of her in the film, but you just don't want to go down that road because you can't come back. I think we got room for maybe one or two. I see one hand in the back.
Yeah, so this isn't necessarily related to the movie, but I would love to hear their perspective on. So I grew up in Sarasota, and Buck O'Neill's presence is in the Orioles. Their minor league complex after him basically grew up playing there. They here in downtown Sarasota, the city, and the Orioles. I honestly didn't realize that he played in Jacksonville and at Waters. Can you just talk a little bit more about him and his impact here in the city of Jacksonville? And was he the most famous Negro League player to come out of Ed Waters or Jacksonville?
From Edward Waters, yes. He made his mark here in Jacksonville, like I spoke about it before, through the high school portion and then through the college portion, and then playing with the Red Caps and then leaving the Red Caps to go play for the Monarchs. So he built his career path here in Jacksonville at Edward Waters. With that being said, we did have the opportunity, myself and Brother Washington, to bring Buck O'Neil to Jacksonville back in 2000, but before he was deceased. And when we had a conversation with Buck, he told the story about taking the train from Sarasota and sitting in the back of the train, and he only had a peanut butter sandwich and a hard-boiled egg. And when he was talking to us about playing ball here in Jacksonville, it was one of his most happiest times because he couldn't had the opportunity to play in Sarasota at the time, only because Sarasota at the time was he responded on it was only for migrant workers, and it didn't have the environment that he would needed to be able to be developed into a great baseball player. So when he took the train to come to Jacksonville, and he often told us about walking out of the train station and seeing 8 trains on both sides. He only saw one train when he was in Sarasota. And he came on the Florida Coastal train. But he was a very, very well-spoken gentleman. He talked only about baseball, and he had a lovely family in Kansas City. We did have the opportunity to go to Kansas City to visit him, and he took us to the Negro Museum on Vine Street in 18th in Kansas City, and we had a chance to understand what Buck was all about. Buck was all about advancing baseball, not only for African Americans, but for everybody. And when we left the museum, we went over to the Kansas City Royals, and they have a museum only about Buck. You can walk with Buck to the stadium, and you just like in Hollywood, because that's how they treated Buck. So Buck was a great player, an outstanding person, an outstanding father, and his wife, she just a beautiful person, a beautiful soul to have gone through that with Buck. Because to tell you the truth, Buck always stated that if it was not for his family, he wouldn't have been able to make it.
If I may tell you about my experience with Buck O'Neil. I worked for Times Union for 38 years, and I was going to school during the day, and I was taking the photojournalism class, so I was laying in the bed one day, and one of the editors called me and said, "Lloyd, yeah, how about going up to Edward Waters College and shoot a picture of the baseball team and one of its alumni?" I said, "Okay, no problem." So I go up there, and baseball team is doing what they do, and I'm getting frustrated because I'm wasting my time as far as I was concerned. So up pops, a car drives up, it's the president and this gray-headed gentleman. I said, well, so I got my cameras out, getting ready to shoot the pictures, and I said, well, who is this guy? And everybody on the team looked at me. And that's how I met Buck O'Neil.
Buck, I think, was probably the #1 best ambassador for the Negro Leagues out of anybody. And thanks to him, he was the voice in Ken Burns's baseball documentary about the Negro Leagues. I think that thanks to Buck O'Neil, many more people discovered the Negro Leagues, and that helped just open up that opportunity for myself and others to then continue sharing those stories. And for me, I told each player who I interviewed that I can't promise you where it's going to end up, but what I can promise is I'm going to do my best to make sure that your stories are preserved and your legacy is preserved and shared so that people can hear your version, to hear you personally. And so what we've been doing this summer is a barnstorming tour with minor league baseball in the same idea of how the Negro Leaguers would often travel. And so this is our 11th, I think I might have said this earlier, 11th out of 12 stops. And I just really wanted to give a big thank you to Jacksonville and to the Jumbo Shrimp, because they were the first team to hop on board who just immediately got what this could do, how this could bring community together. And I don't take that lightly, because this is a really important venue for me. And so I just wanted to thank the team and also minor league baseball, but very much thank you to the team for hosting this.
Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Another round of applause for our distinguished panelists.